Let's get started. Story number 1.
We had been searching for a house for months, navigating the chaotic real estate market. Everything we saw either felt too small, too overpriced, or needed far more work than we could afford. Then, one afternoon, we stumbled upon it. A modest 2-story house on the outskirts of town, nestled among tall oaks. It looked charming at first glance, a bit weathered, but with potential. The price was more than reasonable, almost suspiciously so. The agent explained that the house had been on the market for a while, and though it needed some work, it was solid. We made an offer, and within weeks, we were moving in. It was our dream home in many ways, and we couldn't wait to make it our own. The house had a cozy feel with dark wood floors and a large fireplace in the living room. There was something quaint about the way the old windows let in just enough light without feeling too exposed, and the garden had wildflowers growing in it, unkempt but beautiful. Even with all the small imperfections, it felt right. The previous owners were an older couple. They'd lived in the house for decades, but they'd both passed away in the last few years. The family had kept the house on the market for a while after their deaths, and the agent mentioned that some potential buyers had been put off by the stories surrounding it. Apparently, there had been rumors of strange occurrences, but we were too excited to be deterred. I shrugged it off, thinking it was just small-town gossip. The first few nights were peaceful. We spent our evenings unpacking boxes, rearranging furniture, and getting used to the space. But as the days went on, I started to notice things. Little things at first, things that could easily be explained away. A door that would creak open when I was sure I had closed it, footsteps that seemed to echo in the hallway when no one was around, and the faintest whispers when I was alone in a room. I kept these things to myself. I didn't want to sound paranoid, and Nathan, my husband, was always the practical one. "It's just an old house settling," he would say, brushing off my concerns. "Don't overthink it." But it wasn't just the little things. One night I woke up to the sound of someone crying. The soft sobs drifted through the walls, almost as if they were coming from the other side of the house. I sat up in bed, straining to hear more clearly. The crying continued for what felt like an eternity. I nudged Nathan awake. "Do you hear that?" I whispered. He groggily listened but heard nothing. "It's probably just the wind," he muttered, rolling over to sleep. I wasn't convinced, but I didn't want to wake him any more than I already had. The crying continued intermittently, but I couldn't tell if it was coming from the house itself or if it was just my imagination. Eventually, I fell asleep, but the sound haunted me for days afterward. A few weeks later, the whispers began. I would hear them late at night, low and unintelligible, just on the edge of my hearing. It wasn't as though they were coming from one specific place, but rather from all around me. I tried to tell myself it was just the house's creaky plumbing or the house settling, but there was something unnerving about it. Sometimes I would walk past the living room only to hear faint murmurs as if someone was sitting there talking to themselves. Other times, it sounded like the voices were coming from upstairs. But when I went to check, the rooms were always empty. One evening, after work, Nathan and I decided to explore the attic. We had barely touched it since moving in, and I was curious about what we might find. The attic was small, dusty, and filled with old furniture, trunks, and what appeared to be decades of accumulated belongings. Among the piles of junk, I found an old photograph. It was a picture of a young woman standing outside the house with a smile on her face. She was wearing an old-fashioned dress, and her eyes, although blurry from age, seemed to hold a sadness that I couldn't quite place. Something about her unsettled me. I showed Nathan the picture, but he just nodded, not seeing what I saw. "It's probably just a distant relative or something," he said. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I recognized her somehow. The longer I stared at the photograph, the more certain I became that I had seen her before, though I couldn't explain where or when. Things started getting worse after that. One afternoon, when I was in the kitchen making lunch, I heard a loud crash from upstairs. I froze, listening intently. Another crash, followed by the unmistakable sound of someone, moving across the floor. My heart raced as I grabbed the phone and dialed Nathan. When he answered, his voice was calm, but he didn't sound surprised. "It's probably the wind, or maybe something fell over," he said. But even as he spoke, I could hear the tension in his voice. He knew I was rattled. I went upstairs to check, and sure enough, there was nothing. No broken glass, no fallen furniture. The hallway was as quiet and empty as ever. But the air felt thick, as though it had been disturbed somehow. I went into the master bedroom, but even that felt off. I couldn't explain it. The room was cold, despite the warmth from the sun outside. Over the next few days, the disturbances became more frequent. The whispers, the crying, the creaking floorboards, they all intensified. I woke up one night to see something standing at the foot of our bed. It was a figure barely visible in the moonlight, but unmistakable. It was a woman dressed in a long, flowing gown. Her face was obscured, but I could see the shape of her shoulders, the curve of her back as she stood motionless at the edge of the bed. I gasped and reached for Nathan, shaking him awake. He opened his eyes groggily, but by the time he looked up, the figure was gone. "I swear I saw something," I said, my voice trembling. Nathan just sighed and rubbed his eyes. "It's probably a dream," he said. "You're stressed. You're imagining things." But I wasn't imagining it. I could still feel the weight of her presence in the room. I couldn't explain it, but I knew what I had seen. I decided to do some research about the house, trying to find out if there were any stories or histories tied to it. I went to the town's historical society and asked about the house. The woman behind the counter gave me a strange look when I mentioned it. She asked if I was aware of the previous owners, the McAllisters. "They were a sweet couple," she said, her tone dropping slightly. "But they were elderly. The wife, Susan, passed away about 10 years ago, and the husband followed not long after. They didn't have any children, so the house went to the bank after that." When I asked if anything strange had ever happened in the house, her expression darkened. "There are always rumors, but some people swear they've heard things at night. People say Susan still comes back sometimes. You know how these old houses can be?" she said, her voice trailing off. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, as the same whispers I had heard before began to fill the room. This time they were clearer, more distinct. I could make out words, but they were jumbled, as though the voices were trying to tell me something, but couldn't quite get it right. The next morning, I decided to confront Nathan about it. I couldn't keep pretending like everything was fine. He listened patiently, but his expression grew more serious as I explained everything. The figure, the voices, the strange feeling in the house. "Maybe we need to have someone come in," he said quietly. "Maybe a medium or someone who knows about this stuff." We contacted a local paranormal investigator who agreed to come over and do a walkthrough of the house. The moment she stepped inside, she stopped dead in her tracks. "There's a presence here," she said. "It's strong. The energy is unsettled." After a few hours of investigating, she told us that there was indeed a spirit in the house. Susan McAllister. She had died in the house, and her spirit was restless, unable to fully move on. The investigator performed a cleansing ritual, and afterward, things began to quiet down. The whispers stopped, the figure at the foot of the bed never appeared again, and the house felt lighter. Though we didn't understand it fully, we were relieved. It was as if Susan had simply wanted someone to acknowledge her presence. Since that night, the house has felt like a true home, a place of peace. But I can't help but wonder sometimes if she's still here, watching over us. The house feels calmer now, but there are still moments, just before sleep, when I sense her watching from the corner of the room. I can't help but think she's at rest now, waiting for something or someone. Story the end.
Story number 2.
We moved into the house on Hawthorne Street in the spring of 2018. It wasn't a dream house, but it was perfect for us. A modest 3-bedroom with a backyard, tucked away in a quiet neighborhood just on the outskirts of town. The price was right, and the owners had been eager to sell. They mentioned that they had lived there for over 20 years, but it was time to move closer to their grandchildren. The house was charming in its own way, though it had that aged, lived-in feeling. The walls were slightly worn, and the floors creaked as if they had stories to tell. I remember walking through the front door with my husband Sam and our 2 kids, Sarah and Ben. The house felt alive, welcoming, and we imagined building our lives there. The previous owners had left behind some of their old furniture, including a large wooden dining table and a few mismatched chairs that we decided to keep. Everything seemed perfect at first, until the little things started happening. It began slowly. A door that I was sure I had closed would be wide open the next time I walked past it. At night, I could hear what sounded like soft footsteps in the hallway, but when I checked, no one was there. I brushed it off as the house settling or my imagination running wild. Sam didn't think much of it either. He'd been busy with work, and he's always been the type to dismiss things like that. One evening, after putting the kids to bed, I sat down in the living room, flipping through a book. That's when I heard the knock. It wasn't a loud knock, just a soft tap, almost as if someone was trying to get my attention. I set the book down and got up, walking toward the front door. No one was there. I figured it was a trick of the wind, maybe a tree branch tapping the window or the house settling again. I didn't think much of it, but the knocks happened more frequently. Sometimes it was one tap, sometimes two, always when I was alone. The first time Sam heard it, he dismissed it too. "It's just the house," he said. "It makes noises. Houses like this do that." But the knocking wasn't the only thing. One afternoon, I was in the kitchen preparing lunch when I felt a chill wash over me. The windows were all shut, the air conditioner wasn't running, yet I couldn't shake the feeling of coldness. Then I heard it, a faint voice, almost like a whisper, coming from the hallway. I froze. It was a woman's voice, soft and distant. I strained my ears, but it was just one word. "Help." I walked cautiously down the hallway, but there was no one there. I checked the kids' rooms. Both were sound asleep. Sam was still in his office, working. I told myself I was imagining things and tried to ignore it. I figured it was just the stress of settling into a new home. Days passed, and the occurrences continued. The whispering voice came more frequently, always when I was alone. It wasn't loud enough to alarm me, but it was enough to make me uneasy. I began feeling like I wasn't really alone in the house, as though someone was watching me. I started locking the doors at night, even though I knew there was no real reason to. I didn't tell Sam. He would only say it was nothing to worry about. Then one night, the kids woke up screaming. I rushed to their rooms, both of them terrified, clutching their blankets. Sarah was crying uncontrollably. "There's someone in the hallway, Mom," she shouted. "A woman in a white dress. She's standing there and watching us." Ben, who was usually calm and collected, looked pale and shaken. "I saw her too, Mom," he said, his voice shaking. "She was at the door." She was so still. I tried to comfort them, but my heart was pounding in my chest. I didn't know what to say. I checked the hallway and the entire house, but there was no one. I held them close, trying to reassure them, but they wouldn't calm down. After that night, Sarah refused to sleep in her room alone. Ben kept talking about the woman, saying she was there, watching from the dark corners of the hallway. Sam didn't believe in ghosts, so he shrugged it off as bad dreams. But I knew something wasn't right. I had never been one to believe in the paranormal, but the strange happenings were becoming too frequent to ignore. I did a little research into the history of the house, hoping to find an explanation for what was going on. I discovered that the house had been built in the 1920s, and over the years, it had passed through several owners. But there was one name that stood out, a woman named Margaret, who had lived there in the late 1930s. According to the records, Margaret had lived alone in the house after her husband died during the Great Depression. She had been a widow for many years before she passed away in the house. The story didn't mention anything unusual, but there was a lingering sense of sadness in the records. Margaret's life had been a lonely one, marked by the absence of family, and it seemed that she had spent her last years in the house, quietly waiting for the end. That night, as I lay in bed, the house felt heavier than usual. The whispers were back, but now they were more distinct. "Help me," it said again. It was so close, almost as if the voice was coming from right next to me. I felt a chill run down my spine, and I sat up in bed, heart pounding. Sam was asleep beside me, oblivious to the voice. I turned on the lamp, but when I looked around, the room was empty. There was no one there. In the days that followed, I couldn't shake the feeling that Margaret was still in the house, that her spirit hadn't moved on. It was as though she was trapped, lonely, still yearning for something. I tried talking to her, asking her to leave us in peace, but it only seemed to make things worse. The knocking became louder, the whispers more frequent, and the temperature in the house seemed to drop for no reason at all. One night, desperate for answers, I contacted a local paranormal investigator. He agreed to visit the house and bring his equipment. When he arrived, he immediately noted the strange energy in the air, a heaviness that seemed to permeate the entire house. He set up cameras and motion detectors, then sat with me in the living room. "Margaret," he called gently, "we know you're here. We're not here to harm you, but if you're in pain, you need to move on." The house was silent for a long time. Then a soft knock echoed from the hallway, just like the ones I had heard so many times before. The investigator turned to me, his eyes wide. "It's her," he said quietly. "She's trying to communicate." We spent hours talking to Margaret that night, using an EVP, electronic voice phenomenon recorder, to capture her responses. She told us in a soft, broken voice that she had been lonely in life and she was still waiting for her family to return. She didn't know how to move on. The investigator explained that she needed to let go of the past, that she wasn't alone anymore, that it was time to find peace. When the session ended, the atmosphere in the house felt different. The whispers had stopped, the temperature returned to normal, and the knocking was gone. That night, for the first time in weeks, I slept soundly. Over the next few days, the house felt lighter. The unease that had settled in every corner seemed to dissipate. The children were no longer scared to sleep in their rooms, and the air didn't feel as heavy. It was as though Margaret had finally found peace. We still live in the house on Hawthorne Street, but the strange occurrences stopped after that night. I don't know if Margaret moved on, but I'd like to think that she did. And in some way, I hope she found the peace she had been searching for all those years. Story the end.
Story number 3.
It started with the smell. A faint, sweet aroma of lilies lingered in the air when Sarah and James first moved into their new house. At first, they thought it was left over from the previous owners. After all, the house was a century-old Victorian with creaky floorboards and an old-world charm that Sarah had fallen in love with the moment she saw it. The house was nestled at the edge of a small town surrounded by dense woods. It was the kind of place where neighbors greeted each other from their porches and news traveled fast. The realtor had mentioned the house's unique character, but conveniently avoided explaining the whispers Sarah caught from the neighbors during their first walk down the street. It wasn't until their first night that things began to feel off. Sarah woke at exactly 3:14 a.m. to the sound of faint humming. Groggy and disoriented, she nudged James, who groaned in protest and turned over. The humming was soft, almost melodic, and seemed to be coming from the hallway. Wrapping herself in her robe, Sarah tiptoed out of the bedroom. The wooden floors groaned under her weight, and the humming stopped abruptly as she reached the top of the stairs. She peered into the darkness below, her heart thumping loudly in her chest. "Hello?" she called out, her voice barely a whisper. No response. The next morning, Sarah dismissed the incident as a dream. James teased her about watching too many ghost hunting shows, but she couldn't shake the eerie feeling that someone, or something, had been there. Over the next few days, the occurrences became harder to ignore. The scent of lilies grew stronger and seemed to move from room to room. Lights flickered despite James's assurances that the wiring had been inspected. Doors that were firmly shut would be found ajar, and objects, keys, books, Sarah's favorite coffee mug, would disappear only to reappear in the most peculiar places. One evening, as Sarah was unpacking boxes in the attic, she came across an old leather-bound journal hidden in a dusty chest. The name Margaret Hensley was written elegantly on the inside cover. Intrigued, Sarah flipped through the pages. The entries were dated from the early 1900s and chronicled the life of a young woman who had lived in the house. The writings were mostly mundane, accounts of garden parties, recipes, and musings about the seasons, until the entries abruptly shifted tone. July 17, 1907. The lilies bloomed early this year. Their scent is overwhelming, almost suffocating. I feel as though they are watching me. August 3, 1907. He comes at night, humming that dreadful tune. I cannot sleep. I cannot breathe. The lilies wilt, but their scent remains. Sarah's hands trembled as she read the final entry, dated August 15, 1907. I cannot endure this any longer. If you find this, know that I am sorry. The lilies hold my secret. She slammed the journal shut and descended the attic stairs in a rush, nearly colliding with James at the bottom. "What's wrong?" he asked, his brow furrowed with concern. "Nothing," Sarah lied, clutching the journal tightly. "Just dusty up there." That night, the humming returned. Louder this time. Persistent. Sarah shook James awake, and together they followed the sound to the living room. The humming stopped as they entered, but a sudden chill filled the air. The faint outline of a figure, a woman in a long dress, stood by the fireplace. Her face was obscured, but Sarah could see her head tilted as if listening. James froze, his hand gripping Sarah's. "Do you see that?" Before Sarah could respond, the figure turned and walked through the wall, staff vanishing into the darkness. The scent of lilies was overpowering now, making Sarah's eyes water. Determined to find answers, Sarah returned to the journal the next day and combed through the entries for clues. She eventually pieced together a grim story. Margaret Hensley had fallen in love with a man her family did not approve of. Their affair ended tragically when he was killed in a supposed hunting accident on the property. Consumed by grief and guilt, Margaret had taken her own life, and her body was found in the lily garden. Armed with this knowledge, Sarah and James decided to confront the lingering spirit. They researched rituals to help restless souls find peace and prepared to perform one in the garden. On a cold, moonlit night, they stood among the overgrown lilies, candles flickering in the breeze. "Margaret," Sarah called out, her voice steady, "we know your story. We're here to help." The humming began again, soft and mournful. The candles flickered wildly before extinguishing altogether. The figure of the woman appeared at the edge of the garden, her form more distinct than before. She stared at Sarah with hollow, sorrowful eyes. "Please," Sarah whispered, tears streaming down her face. "You don't have to stay here anymore." For a moment, everything was still. Then the scent of lilies faded, and the figure slowly dissolved into the night. The air felt lighter, the oppressive weight that had hung over the house lifted. In the days that followed, the strange occurrences ceased. The house felt warm, inviting, and truly theirs. Sarah and James planted fresh lilies in the garden to honor Margaret, ensuring her story would not be forgotten. But every so often on quiet nights, Sarah thought she could hear the faintest hint of a melody drifting through the air, a reminder of the house's bittersweet past. Story the end.
Story number 4.
Moving day felt like the beginning of a new chapter for Olivia and her husband, Eric. After months of searching, they'd finally found a house they could call their own, a 2-story colonial-style home tucked at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac. The house was older but solidly built, with large bay windows and a backyard lined with towering oak trees. It was everything they had dreamed of, and the price was surprisingly reasonable, almost too reasonable. The previous owner, an elderly man named Mr. Grayson, had passed away a year earlier. His children, eager to sell, had included the furniture in the deal. Olivia found it charming that many of the rooms still had an old-world feel, complete with antique armchairs and faded floral wallpaper. Eric, however, was more interested in the practicalities of homeownership, fixing up the creaky stairs, updating the plumbing, and replacing the ancient furnace in the basement. The first few days were spent unpacking boxes and settling in. The house had a stillness about it, almost like it had been waiting for someone to bring it back to life. Olivia felt strangely comfortable there, even as she noticed little oddities. The way the air felt colder in the hallway upstairs, the faint scent of roses in the dining room that came and went, and the faint clicking sound she sometimes heard late at night. Eric was less convinced. "It's an old house," he said when Olivia mentioned the sounds. "Pipes, wood settling, maybe even mice. We'll figure it out." But Olivia wasn't so sure. One night, as she was organizing the bookshelf in the living room, a framed photo fell off the mantel and shattered on the floor. She jumped, her pulse racing. The photo had been one of Mr. Grayson and his late wife. Olivia picked it up, apologizing aloud for some reason she couldn't quite explain, and placed it back on the mantel. That night, she dreamed of a woman standing at the foot of her bed, staring down at her. The woman's face was blurry, her expression unreadable. Olivia woke with a start, her heart pounding. The next morning, Eric found her in the kitchen, her eyes red from lack of sleep. "I had a weird dream," she confessed, stirring her coffee. "A woman was in our room. I think it was her, the woman in the photo." Eric chuckled, though it lacked conviction. You've been working too hard. Let's take a break this weekend. Maybe go for a hike or something. But the house had other plans. That evening, as Eric was tinkering in the basement, Olivia decided to explore the attic. She'd avoided it until now, mostly because the pull-down ladder made her uneasy, but curiosity got the better of her. With a flashlight in hand, she climbed the creaky steps and entered the dark, dusty space. The attic smelled of mildew and old wood. Boxes were stacked haphazardly, and cobwebs clung to the beams. As Olivia moved deeper into the attic, her flashlight beam landed on something odd. A small, child-sized rocking chair positioned in the corner, as if someone had left it there intentionally. It swayed slightly, though there was no breeze. A chill ran down her spine as she approached it. Next to the chair was a wooden box, its lid slightly ajar. Inside, Olivia found a collection of old toys. A stuffed rabbit with missing eyes, a cracked porcelain doll, and a faded red ball. Beneath the toys was a bundle of yellowed papers tied with string. Carefully, she untied the bundle and began reading. The papers were letters, written in an elegant hand. They spoke of a family who had lived in the house decades ago, the Graysons, but not the elderly couple she knew of. These letters belonged to an earlier generation. The letters revealed a tragedy: a young daughter, Clara, who had died in the house after falling ill. The final letter, written by Clara's mother, was a plea for forgiveness. It spoke of guilt, of feeling responsible for Clara's death, and of hearing her daughter's voice in the house long after she was gone. The air in the attic felt heavier as Olivia read. She suddenly felt like she wasn't alone. Her flashlight flickered, and she spun around, her breath catching in her throat. For a split second, she thought she saw a shadow dart across the far end of the attic. She didn't remember running down the ladder, but the next thing she knew, she was in the kitchen, shaking. Eric found her there, clutching the letters. "I'm not crazy," she said, her voice trembling. "This house, something happened here, and it's still here." Eric took the letters and read them. His usual skepticism was replaced with concern. "Okay," he said finally, "let's figure this out." The next day, they did some digging. At the town library, they found records confirming Clara Grayson's death in 1925. She had been 8 years old. The cause of death was listed as scarlet fever. The librarian, an elderly woman who had lived in the town her whole life, lowered her voice as she shared what she knew. "People always said the house was touched," she said. After Clara died, her mother swore she could still hear her. Laughter, footsteps, even crying. When the family moved, they said the new owners heard the same things. It's been like that ever since. That night, Olivia and Eric sat in the living room, unsure of what to do. The house felt different now, as if it were listening. Olivia suggested they try to communicate, to find out what Clara, or whoever was there, wanted. They lit a candle and sat at the dining table. "If there's anyone here," Olivia said, her voice shaking, "we just want to help. Can you show us a sign?" For a moment, nothing happened. Then the candle flickered violently and a faint tapping sound echoed from the hallway. Olivia clutched Eric's hand as the tapping grew louder, moving closer. The air grew cold and the scent of roses filled the room. "Clara?" Olivia whispered. "Is it you?" The tapping stopped. The silence was deafening. Then a soft, childlike voice came from the darkness. "Mama?" Olivia's eyes filled with tears. "We're not your mama," she said gently. "But we're here. We hear you." The voice didn't respond, but the temperature in the room slowly returned to normal, and the candle's flame steadied. Over the next few days, Olivia and Eric took small steps to honor Clara's memory. They cleaned the attic, keeping her toys and letters in a special box. They planted flowers in the backyard, a small garden where Clara could play. The activity in the house seemed to lessen, and the oppressive feeling lifted. One night, as Olivia was drifting off to sleep, she felt a light pressure on the bed, as if someone small had sat down. She opened her eyes, but saw nothing. Instead of fear, she felt a strange sense of peace. The house was quiet after that. The occasional creak or faint laugh still echoed through the halls, but it no longer felt threatening. It was as if Clara, or whatever part of her lingered, had found comfort in their presence. Olivia and Eric stayed in the house for years, raising their own children there. They never forgot Clara, though, and her rocking chair remained in the attic, a silent reminder of the house's history and the little girl who had once called it home. Story the end.
Story number 5.
In the early spring of 2023, Sarah and Mark Henderson moved into their dream home. Nestled in a quiet cul-de-sac on the outskirts of a small New England town, the 3-story Victorian house boasted a wraparound porch, stained glass windows, and a turret room that Sarah had fallen in love with at first sight. Though the house was over a century old, its renovations gave it a modern touch while preserving its historic charm. For the first few days, life in the new house was bliss. The couple busied themselves unpacking, arranging furniture, and exploring their sprawling backyard. But on their 4th night, Sarah woke to a faint creaking sound. She turned to check if Mark had heard it, but he was fast asleep. The sound grew louder, more deliberate, as if someone were pacing in the hallway outside their bedroom. Convincing herself it was the old house settling, Sarah tried to go back to sleep, but the pacing continued. Finally, she nudged Mark awake. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. Mark groggily listened for a moment before shaking his head. "It's probably just the wind or the floors expanding. Go back to sleep." But Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The next morning, she mentioned the noises to their next-door neighbor, Mrs. Avery, an elderly woman who had lived in the neighborhood her entire life. Mrs. Avery hesitated, her weathered hands gripping her teacup tightly. "Well, that house has a history," she said cautiously. "Not that I want to spook you, dear, but the family who lived there before you, well, they didn't stay long." Sarah pressed her for details, but Mrs. Avery only shook her head. "It's probably nothing," she added quickly, "just old stories." That evening, Sarah tried to shake off Mrs. Avery's cryptic remarks, but the unease lingered. After dinner, she and Mark decided to explore the attic. Among the cobwebbed rafters and dusty boxes, they found an old trunk with a brass lock. Surprisingly, the lock was unlatched. Inside were yellowed papers, faded photographs, and a leather-bound journal. The photos were of a stern-looking family, a man, woman, and a little girl with hollow eyes. Their clothes suggested the pictures were taken in the early 1900s. The journal belonged to the man, Jonathan Crowley, the home's original owner. As they skimmed the entries, the words grew darker. Jonathan wrote about his daughter, Abigail, who had become unwell after an accident in the house. He described sleepless nights, strange noises, and Abigail's claims of seeing shadow people in her room. The final entry read, "She is gone, but her whispers remain." Sarah felt a chill crawl down her spine. Over the next week, the unsettling occurrences escalated. Lights flickered without explanation. Doors that had been securely shut were found ajar. Mark brushed it off as quirks of an old house, but Sarah grew increasingly uneasy. She began hearing whispers at odd hours, soft, indistinct voices that seemed to come from the walls. One night, while Mark was working late, Sarah decided to investigate the turret room, which had quickly become her least favorite part of the house. The room felt heavy, as if the air itself resisted her presence. She turned on her phone's flashlight and stepped inside. The wallpaper was peeling in places, revealing layers of older designs beneath. One corner of the room caught her attention. The floorboards there seemed newer, as if they had been replaced. She knelt and tapped the boards. They sounded hollow. Driven by a mix of curiosity and dread, Sarah fetched a screwdriver and pried up the loose boards. Beneath them was a small, locked box. She carried it downstairs, her heart pounding. When Mark returned home, they opened it together. Inside was a tattered doll, its porcelain face cracked, and a bundle of letters. The letters were written by Abigail, addressed to someone she called the Watcher. They were chilling, full of childlike scrawls about a dark man who visited her at night and told her secrets. "He said he's waiting," one letter read. "He said he'll never leave." That night, Sarah couldn't sleep. She kept hearing soft thuds as if someone were knocking from inside the walls. Then came the whispers, clearer now. One voice, faint but unmistakable, called her name. "Sarah." She sat bolt upright in bed. Mark stirred beside her. "What is it?" he mumbled. "Someone said my name." Mark sighed, sitting up. "There's no one here, Sarah. You're letting this get to you." But as the words left his mouth, they both heard it, a soft, dragging sound from the hallway. Mark grabbed a flashlight and crept toward the door. Sarah closed behind. The hallway was empty, but the sound continued, leading them to the attic. As they climbed the narrow stairs, the air grew colder. The dragging noise stopped abruptly. Mark shone the flashlight around the attic, its beam cutting through the darkness. In the far corner, the old trunk was open. "We closed that," Sarah whispered, clutching Mark's arm. Before Mark could respond, a shadow moved across the beam of light. They both froze. The shadow wasn't cast by anything they could see. It moved independently, defying logic. A guttural voice echoed through the attic. "Leave." Mark dropped the flashlight, plunging the room into darkness. They bolted down the stairs, locking the attic door behind them. That night, they slept in their car. The next day, Sarah contacted a local historian who specialized in the area's older homes. When she showed him the journal and the letters, his face turned grim. "The Crowleys were a troubled family," he explained. "Abigail died in that house, in fact, under mysterious circumstances. Some say she fell down the stairs, others believe something or someone pushed her. Jonathan spiraled into madness afterward, claiming the house was cursed. He took his own life in the turret room." The historian offered to put them in touch with a paranormal investigator, but Mark was adamant. "We're not staying here another night," he said. They packed their essentials and left that afternoon. A week later, they sold the house at a loss. As they drove away, Sarah glanced back at the turret room. For a split second, she thought she saw a little girl standing at the window, her hollow eyes watching them leave. Story the end.
Story number 6.
When Hannah and Jake moved into their new home, they were full of excitement and anticipation. It was a charming 2-story house on the edge of a quiet suburban neighborhood. The house had been on the market for a while, which worked in their favor, as they managed to get it at a price that seemed almost too good to be true. It had a spacious living room, a large backyard with a garden, and a cozy kitchen that felt perfect for family gatherings. The house had a warm, welcoming vibe, and the couple couldn't wait to start their new life there. The previous owners, an older couple, had moved to be closer to their children. They left the house nearly empty, except for a few pieces of furniture, which Hannah and Jake were happy to keep for sentimental value. The couple had lived there for over 30 years, and as they were shown around the house, Hannah felt a sense of nostalgia about how well the house had been cared for. But as soon as they moved in, small things started to feel off. At first, it was just the occasional sound, a faint creak in the floorboards or the soft rattle of the windows on windy nights. Hannah assumed it was simply an old house settling, nothing out of the ordinary. Jake, on the other hand, had noticed the temperature fluctuations in certain rooms. It was especially noticeable in the hallway upstairs, where the temperature would drop dramatically, even on warm days. He joked that the house was haunted, but Hannah just rolled her eyes, dismissing his comments as overactive imagination. One night, after a long day of unpacking, they decided to relax in the living room and watch a movie. As the movie played, a strange sound echoed through the house, like a faint tapping noise, almost like someone lightly knocking on the walls. Hannah glanced over at Jake, but he didn't seem to hear it. The tapping continued sporadically, and then it stopped. "You hear that, right?" Hannah asked, looking at him with wide eyes. Jake shrugged, a little uneasy. "It's probably the house settling. We've got to get used to it." Hannah nodded, but couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The house had an odd way of making her feel watched, as if there was something just beyond the corner of her vision. The next morning, as they were cleaning up after breakfast, they noticed something strange. A glass of water that had been left on the counter was now on the floor, shattered into pieces. Neither of them had knocked it over, and no one else had been in the kitchen. "Did you?" Jake began, but Hannah shook her head. "No, I didn't touch it." A shiver ran down Hannah's spine. She had heard stories of houses with strange occurrences, but she never thought she'd be experiencing it firsthand. A few days later, the situation escalated. They both had been at work all day, and when they came home, they immediately noticed that the living room light was on, despite the fact that neither of them had turned it on that morning. Even stranger, the front door was wide open, despite being locked when they left. Hannah immediately went to check on the back door, and it too was ajar. She felt a cold knot of dread in her stomach. Had someone broken in? But nothing was missing. Nothing had been disturbed, and there was no sign of forced entry. "I'm going to call the police," Hannah said, her voice shaking. But before she could pick up the phone, the house suddenly felt colder, and the air felt thick, almost suffocating. Jake took a deep breath and shook his head. Maybe we're just paranoid. It's a new house. Maybe the locks are just faulty. But as the days went on, the feeling of unease only grew stronger. At night, the tapping came again, this time louder and more persistent. It wasn't coming from the walls anymore, but from the floorboards, and every time they tried to investigate, it would stop. One night, as they lay in bed, the sound came again, but this time it was accompanied by something else, a soft voice. It was faint, almost like a whisper, but Hannah could make out a few words. "Help me." Hannah sat up in bed, heart racing. "Did you hear that?" Jake blinked in the darkness. "What? I didn't hear anything." But Hannah was sure. She knew she had heard someone speak, clear as day, asking for help. She got out of bed and walked into the hallway, following the whispering sound. It was coming from the stairs. Her breath caught in her throat as she looked up, but there was nothing there. No person. Just the dim light from the hallway. The next day, Hannah decided to do some research. She went online and found out that the house had once been the site of a tragic event many years ago. The previous owner, Mrs. Belinda Rogers, had lived there with her husband and children. According to local records, there had been a fire that started in the kitchen late one night. Mrs. Rogers and her husband had escaped, but their young daughter, Abigail, had been trapped inside and died in the fire. Hannah felt a sickening chill as she read more about Abigail's death. It was clear that the young girl's death had left a mark on the house. Perhaps it was her presence that lingered, calling out for help all these years later. Feeling both horrified and determined, Hannah decided to investigate further. She went to the local library and found an old photo of Abigail. The little girl had a sweet face with wide eyes and dark brown hair, and it broke Hannah's heart to think of her trapped in the house, alone. That night, they decided to try something that would help them understand what was going on. They set up a simple EVP, electronic voice phenomenon session in the living room, hoping to communicate with the spirit. "Is anyone here?" Hannah asked, holding the recorder. "We just want to understand what happened." The silence was deafening, and then in the recording they heard it. A voice, soft but clear. "Help me, please." Hannah's heart sank. It was Abigail. It was the same voice she had heard before. Jake looked at her, his face pale. "What do we do?" I think we need to help her," Hannah whispered. "She's stuck here. She needs to move on." They spent the next few days trying to figure out how to help Abigail's spirit find peace. They lit a candle in the living room every evening, hoping to offer her some comfort. They spoke to her, telling her she wasn't alone, that they wanted to help her find the light. And slowly, the house seemed to change. The cold spots grew fewer. The knocking sounds and whispers stopped. The air lightened, and the oppressive feeling that had once settled over them seemed to lift. Months passed, and the house finally felt like their own. The strange occurrences became less frequent, and the sense of unease faded. It was as if Abigail had finally found her peace, and in turn, Hannah and Jake found theirs. Every so often, though, they would hear a soft tapping on the walls or feel a brief cold breeze. But it was no longer frightening. It felt like a gentle reminder, a way of saying goodbye. "Thank you," Hannah whispered one evening as she stood in the living room, gazing at the spot where Abigail's spirit had once lingered. And with that, the house truly became their home. Story the end.
Story number 7.
When we first moved into the house on Maple Street, it was everything we had been hoping for. My husband Nathan and I had spent years renting apartments and dreaming of a place to call our own. The moment we stepped into the old farmhouse, we knew it was meant to be. It had that charm you can't find in new homes. Creaky wooden floors, wide windows that let in the light, and an old brick fireplace that took up most of the living room wall. The house was far from perfect. The wallpaper in the bathroom was peeling, and there was a musty smell in the basement. But we saw potential. The owners, an elderly couple, had lived there for decades. They were moving into a smaller house, and it was clear they had taken care of the place for many years. They were kind, and when we first met, they offered to leave behind a few pieces of furniture and some old family heirlooms. It would be nice if someone else could enjoy them. Mrs. Morrow said with a warm smile as she handed me a delicate porcelain doll. The first few days felt like a dream. The neighborhood was quiet, and we had everything we needed to start our new life. But it wasn't long before I started noticing little things, strange things. It began with the light in the hallway. At night, we'd come upstairs to find the light on, even though we were sure we had turned it off before going to bed. Nathan shrugged it off, saying the switch must be faulty. The house was old, after all. But the more it happened, the more uneasy I felt. Then came the footsteps. I could hear them at night, heavy footsteps walking up and down the hallway outside our bedroom. At first, I thought it was just the house settling, but the sounds were too deliberate, too rhythmic to be mere creaks. Nathan never heard them, of course. He always said I was being paranoid. "You know how old houses are," he'd say with a chuckle. One evening, after a long day of unpacking, I decided to take a break and sit on the porch to read. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the yard. I felt at peace for the first time in days. But as I sat there, I heard something that stopped me in my tracks. A soft, distant voice. I couldn't make out the words, but it was definitely a woman's voice, calling out. I looked around, but the street was quiet. I told myself it was probably just a neighbor, but a nagging feeling in my stomach told me otherwise. The voice sounded too close, too familiar. Later that week, Nathan and I decided to explore the attic. We had yet to fully unpack up there, and I was curious about the old boxes that lined the walls. There were stacks of books, old clothing, and wooden crates. As I dug through one of the boxes, I found an old photo album. The pages yellowed with age. Inside were black and white photos of the house from when it was first built, along with pictures of people I didn't recognize. But one photograph caught my eye. A woman standing on the porch, smiling at the camera. Her face was gentle, almost wistful, and her eyes seemed to follow me as I stared at the photo. I couldn't shake the feeling that something about her was off. I set the album aside, but the image stayed with me. Later that night, I mentioned the photograph to Nathan, but he wasn't as intrigued as I was. "It's just an old family album," he said. "Probably just the previous owner's relatives. Let's not get caught up in weird details." But things were starting to feel increasingly strange. One night, I was alone in the house, cleaning up after dinner while Nathan worked late. I heard a loud bang from upstairs, followed by what sounded like furniture being moved around. My heart pounded as I grabbed a flashlight and headed up to investigate. When I reached the top of the stairs, everything was still. The hallway was dark and quiet. The only sound was the steady tick of the grandfather clock in the corner. I checked every room, but nothing was out of place. I chalked it up to my imagination running wild, but the unease lingered. The next day, things escalated. I was in the kitchen making lunch when I heard it. Loud, distinct footsteps walking across the floor above. This time, they weren't just a creak in the boards. They were real, deliberate steps. I froze, my knife midair. The footsteps stopped at the top of the stairs. I grabbed my phone, ready to call Nathan, but before I could dial, the sound of a door slowly creaking open echoed down the hall. The house was empty. I rushed upstairs, my heart racing. The door to the spare bedroom at the end of the hallway was wide open, but no one was inside. I checked the entire floor again, but there was nothing. I felt cold all of a sudden, the air in the hallway thick and heavy, as if something was pressing down on me. I closed the door and tried to shake off the feeling, but it lingered long after I went back downstairs. When Nathan came home later that night, I told him everything. He was concerned, but still skeptical. He suggested that maybe it was a neighbor walking around upstairs, or even a stray animal making noise in the walls. "Houses make weird sounds," he insisted. "I'm sure it's nothing." I wanted to believe him, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong with the house. That night, as we lay in bed, I heard it again. The footsteps. This time they were unmistakable, heavy, dragging footsteps slowly moving across the floor. My heart skipped a beat as I sat up in bed. Nathan stirred but didn't wake up. The next morning, I decided to look into the house's history. I wanted to understand if there was anything about the previous owners that could explain what was happening. I went to the local library and asked the librarian about the house. She hesitated before pulling up some old records. "It's a beautiful house," she said, her voice lowering, "but I'm afraid it's seen its share of sadness." She explained that the house had been built in the early 1900s by a family named the Webbers. They had lived there for many years, but tragedy struck when the wife, Eleanor Webber, died suddenly in the house. Some people said it was an accident, but others believed she had died from a broken heart after losing her children in a fire several years earlier. The Webber family had been devastated by the loss, and Eleanor's death was said to have left a heavy mark on the house. I stared at the old photographs the librarian gave me, and one in particular caught my eye. It was a photograph of Eleanor Webber. Her eyes were wide and filled with sorrow. She had the same wistful look I had seen in the woman's photo in the album. I couldn't help but feel a chill as I looked at her. That night, I told Nathan everything I had learned about Eleanor. He listened quietly, his expression serious. "Do you think it's her?" he asked. "Do you think her spirit is still here?" "I don't know," I whispered, my voice trembling. "But it feels like she's here, Nathan. I can't explain it, but I think she's trying to communicate with us." We decided to try something that night, an experiment of sorts. We lit a candle in the living room and sat in the silence, calling out to Eleanor, hoping to understand why she was still here. For what felt like hours, nothing happened. But then, just as we were about to give up, we heard it, a soft knock on the wall. Nathan and I exchanged a glance, our hearts pounding. We waited, but nothing more came. The house felt still, almost peaceful. It was as if Eleanor was simply acknowledging us, letting us know she was still there, but no longer trapped in sorrow. Over the next few weeks, the strange occurrences grew less frequent. The footsteps stopped, the whispers faded, and the air in the house felt lighter. We still couldn't explain what had happened, but somehow it felt like Eleanor had found a sense of peace, just as we had. The house on Maple Street became our home, a place where we learned to live with the echoes of the past and where we finally found the peace we had been searching for. Story the end.
Story number 8.
When we first moved into our new house, we thought we were getting a great deal. It was an old farmhouse on the outskirts of town, built in the 1920s. The previous owners had put it on the market after their mother passed away, and they were eager to sell. The house was beautiful, big, with plenty of space, and surrounded by a lot of land. My wife, Sarah, and I loved the peacefulness of it, and the fact that it had so much character made it even more appealing. The wooden floors, the high ceilings, the large windows that let in so much natural light, it felt like a dream come true. Our first few weeks were filled with excitement. We spent time unpacking, arranging furniture, and exploring every nook and cranny of the house. The kids, Lily and Max, loved running around the big yard, and we often sat on the front porch in the evenings, enjoying the quiet country air. The house seemed perfect for our family, but after a while, things began to feel different. It started with little things. At first, I thought I was just tired or overworking myself. I would hear strange noises, footsteps on the stairs when no one was there, the sound of doors creaking open when I was sure I had closed them. But I brushed it off. Old houses make strange noises, I reasoned. It was nothing to worry about. But then Sarah started noticing things too. One evening, we were sitting together in the living room, watching TV. The kids were in bed and everything was quiet. I heard a soft thump upstairs, followed by a dragging sound as if something heavy was being moved across the floor. I looked at Sarah, who had already stiffened, her face pale. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. I nodded, getting up to check, but when I reached the stairs, there was nothing. The house was silent. I convinced Sarah it was just the house settling, or maybe one of the kids had dropped something upstairs, but neither of us was entirely convinced. A few nights later, after we had all gone to bed, something happened that shook us both to our core. I was lying awake, trying to fall asleep, when I heard it again, the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from the hallway outside our bedroom. I held my breath, hoping it was just the house shifting, but the steps grew louder, closer. Then the door to our bedroom creaked open. I was frozen, unable to move. I knew Sarah was awake, because I could feel her tense beside me. We both lay there in the dark, listening. The door was still cracked open, though I was sure I had closed it earlier. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the footsteps stopped. The door slowly closed, and the house fell back into silence. I got up, checked the hallway, and found nothing. No one was there. The kids were sound asleep in their rooms. But something didn't feel right. There was a heaviness in the air, a sense of being watched. The next day, I did some research on the house. I wanted to understand if there was a logical explanation. I found that the house had a long history. The family who had lived there before us had been in the house for over 50 years. They were the Martins, a quiet, elderly couple who had lived out their lives there. They'd sold the house after their daughter passed away under mysterious circumstances. She was young, only in her early 20s, and had been found in her bedroom, a victim of a sudden and unexplained illness. No one ever figured out what had caused her death, and it left the family reeling. Her name was Rachel Martin. I tried to shake the feeling that something was wrong, but it kept nagging at me. That night, Sarah and I discussed it again. She had noticed the same things I had, the strange noises, the feeling of being watched. But what bothered us both the most was that Lily and Max had started acting strangely. Lily, our 8-year-old, began having nightmares. She would wake up crying, saying she saw a woman standing by her window. She described the woman as sad and lonely. We thought it was just a phase, something that would pass, but it didn't. Max, who was 5, started saying things that sent chills down my spine. He would talk about a lady who liked to play with him when no one was around. He claimed she would sit with him and tell him stories. He never seemed scared, but his descriptions of her were eerily consistent. He said the woman wore an old-fashioned dress and that she often appeared in the hallway or by the stairs. We had the kids' rooms checked for any signs of bugs or rodents, thinking that maybe they were hearing things that sounded like footsteps or voices. But everything was clear. Still, the atmosphere in the house felt heavier, as if something was pressing down on us. One night, while we were watching TV, I noticed a shadow pass across the hallway outside the living room. It was quick, almost imperceptible, but it was enough to make me get up and investigate. I didn't want to alarm Sarah, so I just walked toward the hallway casually. As I reached the stairs, I stopped. There, at the top of the staircase, I saw a figure standing in the dark. It was a woman, but she was transparent, almost ethereal. She was wearing a long, flowing white dress. Her face was blurry, but I could see enough to know she wasn't looking at me. She seemed lost in thought, staring at the wall. The air around her felt cold, and my heart began to race. I stood frozen in place for what felt like an eternity. Then, as if she sensed me, she slowly turned and vanished. I ran back to Sarah, my breath coming fast, but I couldn't bring myself to tell her what I had seen. I didn't want to scare her, but I knew something had to be done. The next day, I called in a local paranormal investigator. I didn't believe in ghosts at the time, but something about the house was making me question everything. The investigator, a woman named Linda, came to the house with her equipment, EMF meters, cameras, and audio recorders. We agreed to let her spend the night to see if she could pick up on anything unusual. That night, after Sarah and the kids had gone to bed, Linda set up her equipment around the house. She stayed with me in the living room, while the rest of the house was left undisturbed. We sat in silence, listening. After about an hour, Linda's recorder picked up something strange, a faint whisper, almost like a sigh. It was coming from upstairs. Linda motioned for me to follow her. We crept up the stairs where the temperature dropped noticeably. As we reached the top of the stairs, the whispering grew louder. It was coming from one of the bedrooms, the same room where Rachel Martin had passed away all those years ago. When we entered the room, the air was thick with a sense of grief. The room felt cold, and the energy in the space was overwhelming. We didn't need the equipment to tell us something was there. It felt like we were standing in the presence of someone or something, very sad and very lost. Linda spoke softly, asking whatever was there to make its presence known. For a few moments, there was only silence. But then, to my horror, the door to the bedroom slammed shut on its own. We both jumped back in surprise, and Linda immediately started asking the spirit to leave the house in peace. There was another whisper, this time clearer, "I'm sorry." The atmosphere in the room lightened almost instantly. The oppressive feeling started to lift, and the temperature returned to normal. After a few minutes, Linda said the spirit of Rachel had moved on, that she was no longer trapped in the house. We didn't know if that was true, but it felt like something had shifted. From that night forward, the house became livable again. The footsteps stopped, the whispers faded, and Lily and Max stopped having nightmares. The house felt lighter, more peaceful. I still don't know what happened or why Rachel's spirit lingered, but we were grateful to have the house back to ourselves. We never told anyone else about what had happened. People wouldn't have believed us, but for us, the house was no longer haunted. It was a home, finally, in every sense of the word.
Story number 9.
When Emily and Jack first laid eyes on the old farmhouse, they saw potential. The house sat on 5 acres of land, nestled at the edge of a small rural town. It was a classic farmhouse, 2 stories, with a wraparound porch and large windows that let in an abundance of natural light. The red brick exterior was slightly faded from years of wear, and the white trim had chipped in places. But to Emily, it had character. She could already picture the house restored, with a cozy living room, a garden in the back, and the scent of fresh paint and wood filling every room. The couple had been searching for a home for months, and when they found this one, they felt like they had finally found their forever place. It was affordable too, which made it even more appealing. The realtor had mentioned that it had been sitting vacant for some time, but there were no major issues with it, only a few cosmetic repairs. Emily and Jack moved in within weeks, eager to start their new life in the country. The first few days in the house were filled with excitement and the bustle of unpacking boxes, setting up furniture, and making plans for the renovations. They loved the view from the front porch. Rolling fields that stretched out into the distance, dotted with trees and the occasional farmhouse. The air was fresh, and the quiet of the countryside was a welcome change from the noise of city life. But after the initial excitement wore off, something strange began to happen. It started subtly. Jack, who was an early riser, noticed one morning that the kitchen table was slightly different from the way they had left it the night before. It wasn't a dramatic change, just a chair out of place, as if someone had moved it and forgotten to push it back in. He shrugged it off as a mistake, but when Emily noticed the same thing the next morning, they both began to feel uneasy. It wasn't long before other odd occurrences began to happen. They would hear faint noises, footsteps when no one was around, whispers that seemed to come from just beyond their hearing. At first, they tried to brush it off. It was an old house, after all, and old houses creaked and groaned as they settled. But the noises persisted, and they grew more frequent. One evening, Emily was sitting on the couch reading a book when she heard a loud bang coming from upstairs. She jumped, startled, and glanced over at Jack, who was sitting at the kitchen table, sipping coffee. "Did you hear that?" she asked, her voice tense. Jack nodded. "Yeah, I heard it too." The sound had come from the hallway upstairs, and they both stood up and cautiously made their way toward the stairs. They checked every room, but found nothing unusual. It was as if the noise had never happened. Over the next few days, the strange happenings escalated. One morning, Emily went into the bathroom to find the mirror covered in condensation, even though no one had taken a shower. The condensation formed shapes, streaking across the mirror in uneven lines, and it looked almost as though someone had written something on it. She wiped it away with a towel, but it left her feeling unsettled. That night, Emily had trouble sleeping. She tossed and turned, unable to shake the feeling that something was off. At around 2 a.m., she woke up to the sound of a door creaking open upstairs. She turned to Jack, but he was fast asleep beside her. She lay still for a moment, listening. The door creaked again, followed by the soft sound of footsteps walking down the hall. She felt a chill creep up her spine. "Jack," she whispered, shaking him gently. Jack stirred but didn't wake up. The footsteps grew louder, and she could hear them coming closer, almost as if someone was standing at the foot of their bed. Her heart raced, and she sat up in bed, wide-eyed, straining to hear. But then, just as suddenly as the sound had started, it stopped. She waited for a few minutes, holding her breath. Nothing. The next morning, Emily was still shaken, but she tried to dismiss it. She didn't want to worry Jack unnecessarily. When she asked him if he had heard anything during the night, he said he hadn't. Emily decided that maybe it had just been her imagination running wild. But as the days went on, the occurrences continued. One afternoon, while Emily was cleaning the upstairs bathroom, she noticed a picture frame sitting on the edge of the sink. It wasn't one she had placed there. It was a photograph of a man and a woman standing in front of a barn. Emily recognized the photo. It had been on the mantel in the living room when they moved in. She picked it up and felt a strange unease as she studied it. The couple in the picture looked familiar, but she couldn't quite place where she had seen them before. She returned the picture to the living room, but something about it felt off. Later that week, Emily decided to visit the local library to do some research on the house. She figured it would give her peace of mind, knowing more about the history of the property. She asked the librarian if she had any records of the house and its previous owners. The librarian pulled up a few documents and led Emily to a small table where she could look through them. The house had been built in the early 1900s by a family named the Harrisons. Emily scanned the pages, reading about the family's history. There was a mention of a tragic fire that had consumed a portion of the barn, but the house had survived. The family had lived in the house for several decades before moving away. The next few owners had stayed for short periods, but none had remained for long. The last owners, an elderly couple, had moved out about a year before Emily and Jack purchased the house. As Emily read through the documents, she came across a small detail that caught her attention: the name of the elderly couple who had lived there last. They were the Harrisons, William and Helen, the same surname as the original owners. Emily's stomach dropped. Had they been related to the original family, or had they just happened to share the same last name? She brought the documents home and showed them to Jack, but he didn't seem overly concerned. They decided to put it out of their minds, but the house's strange atmosphere continued to weigh on them. One evening, as they sat down for dinner, the power went out. It wasn't a stormy night, and there was no explanation for the outage. The lights flickered and then went dark. Jack got up to check the fuse box, but when he opened the door to the basement, he froze. Emily, his voice shaky, "There's something down there." Emily walked over to him, feeling a sense of dread in her chest. The basement door had opened on its own, and in the dim light, she could see shadows moving. As Jack stepped into the basement, he called out, but there was no response. "I'm going to check it out," he said, trying to sound calm, but Emily could tell he was unnerved. "No, let's just wait for the power to come back on," Emily insisted. But it was too late. Jack was already halfway down the stairs. He called out to her again, but this time his voice sounded distant. Emily hesitated for a moment, then followed him. When she reached the bottom of the stairs, she found Jack standing in front of an old wooden door. It was slightly ajar, and beyond it, she could hear soft whispers. "Jack, what is it?" Emily asked, her voice shaking. Jack didn't respond. He pushed the door open further, and as he did, the whispers grew louder. He stepped into the small room beyond the door, and Emily followed. The room was filled with old furniture, dusty and forgotten. It looked like a storage room, but as Emily's eyes scanned the room, she noticed something strange. A wooden chest in the corner, covered in cobwebs. Something about it seemed important, almost as if it were waiting for them. Jack reached for the chest and opened it slowly. Inside was a collection of old, yellowed papers and a few pieces of personal items, photographs, letters, and a small locket. As he picked up the locket, a sudden cold breeze swept through the room, and the whispers stopped. Emily felt a chill run down her spine. She reached for Jack's arm and pulled him out of the room. They quickly locked the door behind them, and as they made their way back up the stairs, they could hear the soft creaking of the house settling, but the whispers didn't return. The next day, they decided to leave the house for a few days, seeking a break from the unsettling events. They left the town and stayed in a nearby hotel. But when they returned, the atmosphere in the house was different. It was as if the house had been waiting for them to return. The strange occurrences stopped for a while, and Emily and Jack began to believe that the house had perhaps found peace. However, the memory of the locket and the whispers stayed with them. They knew that the house held secrets they might never fully understand. Story, the end.
Story number 10.
When Chris and Emily moved into their new home in the suburbs of Atlanta, they had no idea that it would soon become a source of fear and confusion. After months of searching for the perfect house, they finally found one. a beautiful two-story colonial tucked away on a quiet street. The previous owners had lived there for years, and the house was well kept, with fresh paint on the walls and new carpet throughout. It seemed like the perfect place to start their family. The first few weeks were filled with excitement. They unpacked boxes, painted the nursery, and spent hours getting everything just right. The house was spacious, and the backyard was perfect for their dog Max. They loved the big windows that let in natural light and the cozy fireplace in the living room. It felt like home. But then, strange things began to happen. It started with the basement. Chris was in the process of organizing the boxes in the storage area when he noticed something odd. The air in the basement felt unusually cold, even though it was a warm spring day outside. He shrugged it off, assuming it was just the way the house was built. Old houses often had drafts, after all. But as he moved deeper into the basement, he heard a soft creak behind him. He turned around, but the room was empty. "Must be the house settling," he muttered to himself, but the feeling of unease lingered. Later that week, Emily came home from work to find the kitchen light on. She was certain she had turned it off before she left, but maybe she had forgotten. She didn't think much of it at first, but as the days went by, the incidents became harder to ignore. One evening, Chris swore he had heard the sound of someone walking upstairs, even though Emily was the only one home at the time. He figured it was just the house making noises. After all, old houses creak and groan. But something about the noise didn't sit right with him. Then came the first truly unsettling event. One night, as Emily was getting ready for bed, she noticed something strange. The reflection in the bathroom mirror didn't quite match what she was seeing. It was subtle at first. A small movement in the corner of the reflection, like a shadow that didn't belong. Emily blinked and looked again, but the reflection seemed normal now. She thought she was just tired and shook it off. But the next morning, when she went to brush her teeth, she noticed it again. This time, the shadow was clearer. It seemed to move on its own, as if someone was standing just behind her, although the bathroom was empty. "Chris, you need to see this," she said, her voice shaky as she called her husband into the bathroom. Chris stood beside her, looking at the mirror. He didn't see anything unusual at first, but then the shadow flickered again. "Maybe it's just the lighting," he suggested, though his voice lacked conviction. Emily wasn't so sure. She couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching her. Over the next few days, the house seemed to become more oppressive. The air felt heavier, and at night, both Chris and Emily began to have strange dreams. Emily dreamt of a woman standing at the foot of her bed, staring at her without speaking. Chris dreamt that he was walking through the house, but the rooms kept shifting, as though the house itself was changing before his eyes. Then came the night Emily woke up to find the bedroom door wide open. She had clearly closed it before going to bed, but now it was ajar, just a crack. She didn't hear any footsteps or movement, but the door was definitely open. She sat up in bed, heart racing, staring at the door for several long moments. Slowly, she got out of bed and walked over to close it. As her hand reached for the doorknob, she heard it. A faint whisper, so soft she wasn't sure if it was real. "Emily." She froze. The voice sounded like it was right behind her, but when she spun around, the room was empty. Her mind raced and her breath came in short gasps. She quickly shut the door and climbed back into bed, pulling the covers over her head. She didn't know if she should tell Chris. He would think she was imagining things, wouldn't he? The next morning, Emily hesitantly mentioned the whisper to Chris, but he only gave her a concerned look. "Are you sure? You've been really stressed lately," he said, his tone more practical than sympathetic. Maybe it was just a dream. Emily wasn't so sure. She had been awake. She knew what she had heard. But she didn't want to make a big deal out of it. She didn't want to sound crazy. As the weeks passed, the strange occurrences became more frequent. Doors would open on their own, lights would flicker, and there was a constant feeling of being watched, especially when they were alone. One evening, Chris was in the living room when he heard the distinct sound of someone walking behind him, soft footsteps on the hardwood floor. He turned, but the room was empty. Max, their dog, was lying by the door, not reacting at all. It was as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Then one night, things took a darker turn. Chris and Emily had just finished dinner and were cleaning up when they heard the unmistakable sound of a child crying upstairs. It wasn't just a whimper or a sob. It was the sound of a child in distress, full of fear. Emily's heart dropped into her stomach, and she exchanged a look with Chris. "Is someone upstairs?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Chris shook his head. They hadn't had any children over, and there were no other houses nearby with kids that age. Hesitantly, they climbed the stairs together, their hearts pounding in their chests. As they reached the top, the crying stopped abruptly, and the silence was deafening. They walked down the hallway, stopping in front of the nursery. The door was closed, but as they opened it, they found the room empty, just as they had left it. There was no sign of anyone, no child, nothing that could explain the sound. They were both shaken, but the worst part was yet to come. That night, as they lay in bed, the crying returned. This time, it was closer, coming from just outside their bedroom door. Emily's breath caught in her throat as she listened, her mind racing. She wanted to believe it was just their imagination, but the crying was so real, so desperate. "Chris," she whispered, her voice trembling, "do you hear that?" He nodded, his eyes wide with fear. They both lay still, waiting for the sound to stop. But it didn't. The crying continued, growing louder and more frantic. Finally, Chris couldn't take it anymore. He grabbed a flashlight and slowly made his way down the stairs, Emily following close behind. They checked every room, every closet, every corner of the house, but they found nothing. The house was empty, the air still and silent. By the time they went to bed, the crying had stopped. But neither of them slept. They lay awake all night, listening for any sign that the house had returned to its normal, quiet state. In the morning, Chris suggested they contact a local paranormal investigator. Emily was hesitant at first, but the growing sense of dread in the house was too much to ignore. They needed answers. The investigator arrived the next day, bringing with her a range of tools to measure temperature, electromagnetic fields, and other signs of paranormal activity. She spent hours walking through the house, asking questions and listening for any disturbances. At the end of her visit, she sat them down. "The house is definitely haunted," she said gravely. "There's a presence here, specifically the spirit of a child who died in this house many years ago. The energy is strong and it's feeding off your fear." The investigator explained that the house's history was linked to a tragic event. A young girl had drowned in the bathtub decades ago, and her restless spirit had never found peace. She warned that they would need to perform a cleansing ritual to help the spirit move on. With the investigators' help, Chris and Emily conducted the ritual in the hope of putting an end to the disturbances. The air felt heavy as they lit candles and spoke the words meant to send the spirit to rest. It took hours, but when it was over, the house felt quieter, lighter. In the days that followed, the strange occurrences stopped. The crying ceased, the shadows disappeared, and the house felt like a home again. Chris and Emily never forgot what happened, but they learned to live with the memory of the haunted house they had briefly called their own. Story the end.
Story number 11.
When Claire and Michael bought their first home, it felt like the start of a new chapter. The house was a charming two-story in a quiet suburban neighborhood, just the kind of place they'd been looking for. It had character, old hardwood floors, a large kitchen, and an overgrown backyard that was perfect for the garden Claire had always wanted. The price was right, too. The owners had moved out quickly, and the place had been on the market for just a few weeks. The couple moved in without hesitation, excited to settle into their new life. At first, everything seemed perfect. The house was peaceful, the neighbors friendly, and life felt full of promise. But as time passed, small things began to happen that made Claire feel uneasy. She had always been a logical person, someone who didn't put much stock in the supernatural, but there was something about this house that left her feeling unsettled. It started with noises, strange, subtle sounds that Claire tried to ignore. In the dead of night, she'd hear faint footsteps, as if someone was walking upstairs. Sometimes it would be a creak, as though a door had been slowly opened. She assumed it was just the house settling. Old houses made noises, right? But as the days went on, the sounds became more frequent, and Claire found it harder to shake the feeling that something wasn't right. One evening, while Michael was at work, Claire was sitting in the living room, scrolling through her phone. The house was silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator. But then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw movement, just a flicker in the hallway. She immediately looked up, expecting to see Michael walking toward her, but there was no one there. The hallway was empty. Her heart began to race. She stood up, telling herself it was just a trick of the light, but something told her it wasn't. The next morning, Claire decided to go upstairs to get some work done in the spare bedroom. As she passed the top of the staircase, she saw something strange. The door to the small bedroom at the end of the hall was wide open, even though she was sure she had closed it the night before. She stepped closer and paused, her heart pounding. There was no sign of anyone being in the room, but it felt wrong. The air seemed heavier there, like something was watching her. She shook off the feeling and closed the door, but as she turned to walk back down the hall, she heard something behind her, a soft, almost imperceptible whisper. She spun around, but again, the house was silent. The next few weeks were a blur of odd occurrences. Items would disappear and reappear in different places, nothing major, but enough to make Claire question her sanity. Her keys, her phone, a picture frame, little things that seemed to move on their own. And the whispers, they seemed to follow her, always just out of reach. At night, when Michael was home, she would hear the sounds of footsteps walking across the upstairs floor, even though no one was there. One evening, after weeks of discomfort, Claire finally confided in Michael. She didn't want to scare him, but the house was beginning to feel oppressive. Michael, ever the skeptic, laughed it off. "You're just imagining things," he said, brushing it aside. "It's an old house. It's probably just the pipes or the floorboards creaking." Claire wasn't convinced, but she tried to put it out of her mind. She wanted to believe it was just the house settling, or maybe even stress from work. But it was becoming harder to ignore the feeling of being watched. A few days later, Claire was in the kitchen making dinner when she heard the distinct sound of a door slamming upstairs. She froze, knife in hand, listening. She waited for Michael to call out, but there was nothing. The house was silent again. Slowly, Claire set the knife down and walked toward the stairs, her heart pounding in her chest. She called out for Michael, but there was no answer. When she reached the top of the stairs, she checked every room. No one was there. The door to the spare bedroom, the one that had been left open before, was shut tight. It felt wrong, as though someone or something was hiding just beyond it. Claire stood there for a moment, paralyzed with unease, then decided to open the door. The room was empty, but the air felt cold, colder than it should have been. Claire shivered and closed the door quickly, walking back downstairs. She hadn't even realized she was holding her breath until she reached the bottom of the stairs again. That night, as they sat on the couch together, Claire couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Michael could sense her unease and suggested they go for a walk to clear their heads. As they walked down the quiet street, Claire told him about her experiences again, the footsteps, the door slamming, the cold spots. Michael listened, his expression serious, but he still didn't seem convinced. "I don't know, Claire, maybe you're just stressed." "I don't know how to explain it," she said quietly, "but it feels like something is here with us." They went to bed that night, but Claire barely slept. She tossed and turned, her mind racing. She kept hearing those whispers in her mind, just out of reach, as if someone was trying to speak to her. She had to know more about the house, about its history. She had to find some explanation for what was happening. The next morning, Claire went to the town's library. The librarian was an older woman, and when Claire asked about the history of her house, the woman's face immediately changed. "You live in the old Marlowe place?" she asked, her voice low. Claire nodded. "Yeah, we've only been here a few weeks. Is there something I should know?" The librarian hesitated, looking over her shoulder before speaking. "The Marlowe family, they were the last ones to live in that house. Mr. and Mrs. Marlowe, they had a son, but he died in a car accident when he was a teenager. That was many years ago. But after that, things went downhill for them. The house was sold a few times after the Marlowes left, but no one ever stays there for long. People say the house is haunted. Some say it's the son. His spirit is still there." Claire's blood ran cold. Do you know anything else? Why did they leave? The librarian shook her head. I don't know all the details, but people say Mr. Marlowe was never the same after his son died. He became distant, angry. His wife, she just stopped coming to town after a while. The house, it's got a history, one that people don't like to talk about. I'd be careful. Claire left the library, her mind spinning. She hadn't expected to hear that. As she walked home, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. The house wasn't just old, it was haunted, like the librarian had said. But what did that mean for her and Michael? That night, as Claire lay in bed, the footsteps started again, this time louder than before. She sat up, heart racing, and looked over at Michael, who was still asleep. The footsteps grew louder and seemed to move closer, just outside their bedroom door. Claire was frozen with fear. She didn't know what to do. The air in the room felt thick, and the whispers she had been hearing all week were louder now, almost as if they were speaking directly to her. Get out! The voice was clear now, unmistakable. Terrified, Claire shook Michael awake. Michael, wake up! Michael opened his eyes, disoriented, but he immediately sensed something was wrong. What is it? I hear them, she whispered, her voice trembling. I hear them in the hallway. Michael sat up, looking around the room, but there was no sound, just the faint hum of the refrigerator downstairs. I don't hear anything, Claire. You're probably just dreaming, he said, though his voice lacked conviction. But Claire knew what she had heard. She knew it wasn't a dream. The next day, Claire couldn't take it anymore. She called a local paranormal investigator, desperate for answers. The investigator arrived that afternoon with his equipment, EMF detectors, cameras, and audio recorders. He walked through the house, his expression serious as he examined each room. When he came back downstairs, he looked at Claire with a grim expression. There's definitely something here. I've picked up some strong readings. This house, it's not just old pipes or creaky floors. It's haunted, all right. The investigator told them that the best course of action would be to perform a cleansing ritual to help the spirits move on. It wasn't a guaranteed fix, but it was their best shot at making the house livable again. With the help of the investigator, they performed the ritual that very evening. It took hours, but by the end of it, the house felt different. The air was lighter, and the oppressive feeling that had settled over the place seemed to lift. The footsteps stopped, and the whispers were gone. For the first time since moving in, Claire felt like she could breathe again. But the house, with its history and lingering energy, had left its mark on her. She knew now that some places carried more than just the weight of time. They carried the weight of what had happened there. Story, the end.